After 6 years and shooting thousands of photos with this lens that technically on paper isn't the best at anything, it would have really surprised me all those years ago that this would become one of my favorite lenses in my camera bag. In fact, I believe the RF 35mm 1.8 is one of the most enjoyable lenses you can buy, and likely one of the first I'd recommend for your Canon mirrorless camera, especially considering the price of this thing. Because at the end of the day, most of us taking photos are just doing it for fun, so spending like $2,000 on a lens kind of like hurts the soul a little bit, versus this lens here is 650 bucks Canadian, and I actually got it on sale from the camera store I bought it from for like $400 Canadian, so it wasn't even that much as far as lens pricing goes. Now this is the little brother to the much more expensive and fancier 35mm 1.4 L series lens, and that one will run you about $2,100 Canadian, which is a humongous jump from this lens. So where this more humble 35mm fits into the picture is to be a more affordable entry-level 35mm prime without having to pay for that pro level L series glass. Now I was really curious about the differences in quality and sharpness between this lens and my L series lenses, and I don't have any L series primes, but I made do with what I had, so I used my 24-70 L series lens instead. Now comparing the two lenses side by side, the center of frame with the 35mm prime is likely as sharp, if not sharper, than the 24-70 L series lens. Now I know it's not a perfect comparison because prime lenses are generally sharper just because they have less going on inside of them, but considering the 24-70 is over $2,000, this 35mm is looking pretty good. One thing that I will complain about though is the edges of the 35mm do look quite milky, especially at the wider apertures like 1.8 or 2.8, but as we begin to stop down the lens to 5.6 or f8, it begins to look a lot sharper and less messy around the corners, so I'll give it a pass there. But despite this lens being pretty sharp overall, there were two other areas that made it kind of obvious that this was a lower quality lens. The first was the amount of vignetting around the photos, especially with the wider apertures. At f1.8 there was a ton of vignetting. It does get a little bit better as we go to 5.6 and so on, but that is something to be aware of. Fortunately, you can fix a lot of this stuff within Lightroom and the profile corrections, but it's not going to go 100% away. So if vignetting is something that you absolutely hate, then this lens might have some problems for you. The other area is with chromatic aberration, and when the lens is fully open at 1.8, you can pretty clearly tell the differences between this lens and higher quality glass like the L series. The bokeh is a lot smoother, the chromatic aberration is non-existent at an equal aperture, but overall the 35mm, again, as you stop it down, it starts to look a lot better. Now the thing with all these lens tests, and although mine may not be perfect necessarily, is that it really like nitpicks things that you may not even notice when you're actually taking photos, because some of the things that I discovered while doing these lens tests were honestly news to me and I never noticed them when I was shooting actual photos with this lens. So let's shift gears and talk about where this lens actually excels in, and there's a few key niches of photography that I think it suits really well for. The first is for travel and hiking photos, because if you want something that's really small, compact, lightweight, and especially if you're traveling somewhere like foreign, you don't want to have a lot of attention drawn to your gear, this is a pretty unassuming lens and you can just keep it on, walk around with it, and you can capture pretty much anything that you need. You don't have to mess around with a big heavy lens. At 35mm, it's great for shooting more tight scenes if you're in like a city, or if you're inside somewhere, or if you're just wanting to shoot portraits of the people that you're with. And since it has image stabilization, you can shoot way into the evening when you have really low light and you can still get some really nice shots with it. A second area that this lens would excel at is for street photography, especially since it has a really sharp center of frame. That's where a lot of your subjects are going to be positioned near for the most part, and it's just the right focal length that you can still capture people while you're relatively close, but it also works if you're a little bit further away. I find that 50 mils is like a little bit too tight for that kind of stuff. This lens, in my experience, has been really useful. The third area would be for landscapes and astro. I wouldn't necessarily use this as like a go-to landscape lens because it is kind of limited as being a prime lens, but for night photography, it is super affordable to get a 1.8 lens that is wide enough to capture the stars and sharp enough in most of the frame to really get some nice quality images. You won't necessarily be able to capture those really grand like foreground, midground, background kind of astro photos, but you will still be able to get some better shots than you would with like a 2.8 lens, for example. Next up, if you shoot sports or action, it could be acceptable if you can get close enough to the action. Like, I have shot snowboarding with this lens before, but it is pretty limiting being that it is a fixed focal length. It's also not weather sealed, so you kind of will get varied results with that if you're shooting in the snow, rain, or whatever else. So it's not a huge winner in that area of photography, but it is super packable and it can work as a backup lens just to keep in your bag. Now, the final areas that I think this lens really excels in is with macro as well as a little bit of video. Because it has a super close focus of about 17 centimeters and it has that really sharp center of frame, you can get some great detail shots. At 1.8, the depth of field is pretty razor thin, so you would have to probably focus stack a lot of those things, but if you do stop down to like 5.6 or f8, you can still get some really nice macro shots with a little bit more in focus within a single frame. As for video, a lot of the same benefits that we get on the photo side of things still show through for taking video, but the only downside is that the motor is really slow to go from close focus to far focus, at least compared to some of my other lenses that just feel a little bit snappier. Although the autofocus motor is quite noisy for when you're taking photos, the second you switch into video mode, at least in my experience, it is a lot quieter and those motor sounds tend to go away. If you haven't really shot with primes before, they really help you to think outside of the box in terms of composition, because you no longer have the flexibility to just zoom in and out. You have to actually walk and move your feet, and I find that that really gets the creative juices flowing a lot more with a prime than you do with a zoom. At 35mm, I think it's a lot more enjoyable of a lens to shoot with than a 50mm, just because it has that slightly wider perspective, but things don't look distorted as if you're shooting with a super wide angle lens. The bottom line is that this lens is probably one of the best bang for your buck RF primes that money can buy. And if you're looking to get one of your first prime lenses, or you're just looking to upgrade some of your lenses for your mirrorless camera, this is definitely a lens that I would consider starting with. Considering the price, the sharpness, the versatility of the lens, and how enjoyable it is to shoot with, it is by far one of my favorite lenses in my camera bag. But with all that said, I would love to know what you think of this lens. Have you used it before? And if so, what were your experiences with it? Maybe yours differ from mine. I'd love to have a conversation about it down below.